Hello, I'm Drew Halfmann from UC Davis, and today I want to talk about the question, does the United States have an unusually small welfare state? And we'll mainly be talking about an article by Christopher Howard where he makes an argument that no, the United States does not have an unusually small welfare state. So let's talk about this. First, let's return to a concept that we've discussed earlier in the course, the concept of tax expenditures in the hidden welfare state. Let me make a distinction between three terms. First, in taxation, the government collects money from the taxpayers. For a tax expenditure, which you could also call tax spending, the government gives a tax break for certain activities. It does not collect the money that it could have. Okay, so taxation is taking money. Tax expenditure is not taking money because the person who is being taxed, did something like buy a house or buy childcare or buy health insurance, and so we're going to give them a tax break. Lastly, the hidden welfare state. This is when tax expenditures are used to achieve social welfare purposes. Okay, those definitions in mind, let's look at a few. Let's look at a table. And this is from the Christopher Howard piece that we read for the class. So column A shows the percentage of social expenditure as a percentage of GDP. And so just a reminder that GDP is the total of all the goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. This is the typical way of comparing welfare states. You say, what percentage of their economy are they spending on welfare programs? And here you see that the Scandinavian countries are right at the top. Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark spending 36% of GDP on social welfare programs. Okay, and then you see the United States way down at the bottom, second from the bottom at 15.8%. So by this argument, the United States has a very small welfare state. We turn to column B. Many countries distribute money as a welfare benefit, maybe pensions for the old, for example, and then they tax those pensions, okay? And when you include those taxes on pensions, that reduces the amount that different countries are spending. And you can see that it reduces the amount of difference between those at the top and those at the bottom. The United States is still lagging here at 15% of GDP, but Denmark has now fallen to 26.7% of GDP. Okay, so the gap is getting smaller. And then lastly, we come to the issue of tax expenditures. As we've mentioned in this class, the United States is unique for spending a lot of money on tax expenditures. This ends up, so many of the other countries sort of stay where they were when you look at the tax expenditure column, but you can see that the United States increases from 15%, I believe the lights just went out. We'll be fine. I believe the United States increases from 15% of GDP to 16.4% of GDP once you include tax expenditures. So again, the gap between the high spenders and the low spenders is narrowing here. So we go to the next table. Column A is column A is the column including tax expenditure, so it's the last column in the previous table. So you see the gap between the United States, 16.4 for the United States, 28.5% for Sweden. But we also have to recognize that these countries have different levels of wealth, okay? And the United States is a very rich country. So the United States may only be spending 16.4% of GDP on its population, but because it's so rich, that could end up being more money than other countries. Let's look at the Czech Republic, for example. Czech Republic is about seventh from the bottom. It's spending 19.3% of its GDP on social welfare programs, but because it's a relatively poor country, this amounts to $2,526 per person. The United States, by contrast, is only spending 16.4% of GDP on social welfare, but this amounts to $4,809 per person. Quite a bit more, okay? And so this is basically because the countries have higher levels of income. Now I should add that these comparisons of social spending per person in these countries, they've been adjusted so that there's purchasing power parity between the different countries. In other words, so that a Snickers bar would cost the same in dollars in the Czech Republic as it would in the United States. So let me just reiterate this. By that table, you would have the Czech Republic spending 19.3% of GDP, which amounts to $2,500 per person. The U.S. spending 16.4% of GDP, spending almost $5,000, almost double, $5,000 per person. Now, the Howard piece also makes some other points about other parts of the American welfare state that are not measured by typical metrics of welfare state size. So there's a few of these. So one is regulation. Some countries mandate that employers provide pensions, or that employers provide health care or workers' compensation, or that they provide family and medical leave. These costs are borne by businesses, so they don't appear in the government spending figures, but they are still part of the welfare state. He also makes the argument that the minimum wage in the United States is higher than the European Union average. This does include Southern Europe, which brings down the average, but he's arguing that the minimum wage is another form of government regulation that's part of our welfare state, but that you really can't measure in these figures of welfare state spending. Another example is the American Disabilities Act. This is an employer mandate that employers accommodate people with disabilities. In Europe, the government spends money to provide subsidies to employers who hire people with disabilities. So you can see in the United States, the costs are being borne by the employer. In Europe, they are through government spending, and they show up in social welfare spending figures. There's a few other unmeasured factors as well. One is that the United States provides loan guarantees for mortgage loans to help low-income people or people with a poor credit history to buy homes. These loan guarantees are, again, not part of the expenditure figures. And lastly, tort law. The United States has very high levels of litigation. Americans that are injured in a job may tap into Medicare, Medicaid, workers' comp, or disability insurance, or they can sue. So suing becomes a form of welfare or a substitute for the welfare state. American tort expenditures are double those of Europe, and you could argue that this is part of the welfare state as well. So Howard argues that the American welfare state is average, not small. If you add in those various unmeasured factors, it's probably in the top third of welfare states. Now, there's more to say here. This is a little bit annoying to hear Howard say, oh, the United States welfare state is, not small, it's just average, basically. And we'll talk about this. So first, he argues that the new question becomes not why is the American welfare state small. Instead of the new question becomes, why does the United States use so many policy tools and the particular tools that it does? And we'll talk later in the class that some of the explanations for this are American culture, its individualism, its skepticism of government, also political institutions, the fact that American political institutions are fragmented, and this results in incremental, moderate, sort of diffuse, distributed policies. We'll talk more about all that. But we got to note that even if the United States welfare state is moderate or medium by these measures, there's all sorts of ways in which the American welfare state lags those of countries such as Sweden. First of all, in terms of its scope. There are many programs that the United States does not have. It doesn't have family allowances such as Scandinavia. It does not still have universal health care like most rich countries. It does not have paid family leave like most of the European countries. So we may spend as much, but we have narrower scope. In addition, our programs are typically less generous. Our programs typically were provided at a later point in history. They typically reinforce inequality or contains inequalities within them. We also have the highest poverty rates among the rich countries. So there's all sorts of ways in which, so the new point becomes not that our welfare state is small, but that it's highly unequal and stingy, et cetera, et cetera. The last point I'll add is that as we'll learn later in the class, the United States spends more on healthcare than most of the rich countries, and this is part of the reason why our expenditures are quite high while our actual benefits are quite low. Thanks very much.